Hey guys, welcome back to The Meaning of Life. My name is Eber, and today we're going to be talking about the attributes of divinity, questions 10 through 13 of the Spirit's book. Let's dive right in. Question 10. Can human beings fathom God's innermost nature? No, they lack the aptitude to comprehend it. This basically means that we don't have the capacity or the ability to comprehend God's innermost nature. To attempt to understand God, just like when we're trying to understand infinity or the infinite, we're basically asking ourselves to solve an unsolvable puzzle. It's too much information for us to try to compact. This means that we don't have the capacity to fully comprehend God's innermost nature. Something about the way that we evolved biologically doesn't allow us to think about the infinity. So when we think about this question, right, when we try to understand God, that means that we are also trying to understand this idea of the infinite. You know, mathematically, theoretically, we can understand it, but we can't apply it in a practical sense. Just because we cannot understand God's innermost nature doesn't mean that He doesn't exist. I mean, when we look at ourselves, humans or humanity, for example, right? We are very complicated. We have a lot of emotions and a lot of biological and chemical processes that happen in our body. But despite the fact that we don't fully understand who we are and how we function, we know we exist. So we can also understand that even though we don't comprehend God's innermost nature or fully comprehend and understand God, we can still rest assured that God exists. But then when we put it into perspective, if we can barely understand ourselves, how can we begin to understand something that surpasses our own existence, our own material universe? This is an unsolvable puzzle for sure. Now, will we ever understand God? Let's dive into the next question. Will they ever be able to fathom the mystery of the divinity? When their spirits are no longer eclipsed by matter, and when they have finally purified themselves enough to be able to approach God, then they will see and comprehend God. Now, in this context, when we're talking about eclipsed by matter, we're basically trying to develop the idea that we need to relinquish our attachments to the material universe to be able to understand our divine creator even better. Okay, so in other words, this firstly means that we need to understand that we are more than just a combination of molecules, right? There is more to us than what we feel and what we see in this material universe. But if we go a bit further into this, we also understand the need to detach ourselves from money, the desire for power, the desire for pleasure, and all of these motivations that don't necessarily give us more experience, more knowledge, but just satisfies immediate needs that don't develop our intimate or our moral selves. It is true when we think about our lives is the fact that everything is temporary. Everything in this material universe is temporary. All of us one day will eventually make the transition to the other side. Even the things that stay behind, whether it be our inheritance, money, our house, our car, all of that will eventually degrade. And we know this because we just need to look at history. The money that was valuable back then nowadays is houses, organizations, and cultures that were popular back then today we may not even remember. So everything in this universe is transitory. The only thing that we can truly take is our moral development. With this in mind, the more we grow internally, the more we'll understand the innermost nature of our heavenly creator. So to purify ourselves in this case means for us to mature, to evolve internally or morally speaking, to the point that we live in harmony with the universe, in harmony with God and God's laws. And also, to be pure means that we've paid back all of the mistakes that we did, considering that all of us are learning through a process of trial and error. So we will naturally commit many mistakes, and through these mistakes we learn more about the nature of the universe. We get closer to what reality is, and we also learn what not to do and how to make up for the mistakes that we did when we were more ignorant. So this is the process of moving forward. The more evolved we are, the more mature we are, the better we'll understand God's innermost nature. And we can even see what Allan Kardec's comments here state. The inferior nature of their faculties make it impossible for humans to fathom God's innermost nature. While humanity is in its infancy, people often confuse God with God's creatures, imputing to God their own imperfections. However, they ponder the nature of things more deeply as their moral sense develops, and thus they acquire a truer, though always incomplete, idea of God that conforms more to reason. It's funny because when we look back at older civilizations like the Greek mythology, Roman mythology of all these gods, or even just looking back at the Old Testament, these gods and God have qualities that are very similar to us, like jealousy, anger, lust, the desire for war, the desire and thirst for blood. All of these are qualities that describe us humans, right? And in trying to understand God and in trying to get a clear picture as to its nature, we attributed our own characteristics to it so that we can basically make God a bit more understandable. But we make the mistake when we don't grasp the realization that God is much bigger than we are, is much bigger than the universe that we are. God, our creator, is not like us, the creation. We basically humanize gods and God in a way that we can understand them a little bit better. However, we make the mistake by assuming that they have the same qualities as we do. As we grow older, in a spiritual sense, as we mature more, we grow to understand God's nature deeply. We basically elevate our human nature to understand divinity instead of bringing divinity down so that they're more like human nature. So essentially, our reasoning, our logic is an imperfect compass guiding us forward. And the more we learn, the more accurate this compass becomes, the more accurately we're oriented in a direction that actually moves us forward. The idea of the fact that we will never understand completely what God is also stated in a book called The Kabbalion, which basically states that only the Creator itself is going to be able to understand itself and its creation, whereas we, the creation, can only partially understand it. Since we are within the creation itself, we will never have a complete notion of what God is. But, the more we learn, the better and the clearer, the more logical our conclusions are. Even though we cannot fathom God's innermost nature, can we get an idea of some of the divine perfections? Yes, some of them. Human beings comprehend them better only as they progressively overcome matter, but they can at least get glimpses of them through thought. Reasoning and logic in our thought process is the way that we understand our environment and learn as well. Our logic is the way that we test and explore our environment around us. And the more purified we are, the clearer we can see, the better and more logical our reasoning is. We can even make an example here. We are naturally more advanced than animals, right? Animals don't have the capacity to create the civilization on a global scale like humans have been able to, right? So with this in mind, we understand that we are a little bit more advanced, a little bit more intelligent, and thus we have better reasoning skills than animals. So we can understand God and divinity in a clearer way than an animal can. But with this in mind, it's still imperfect. We have still a long way to go before we can completely understand this. So at this point in our evolution, what can we conclude in terms of God's nature and God's characteristics? Let's go to the next question and see that. When we state that God is eternal, infinite, immutable, immaterial, one, all-powerful, and supremely just and good, don't we have a complete idea of God's attributes? From your own point of view, yes, because you believe that in so stating them, You therefore have named all of them. Nevertheless, you should understand that there are things that transcend the intelligence of the most intelligent person, things your language cannot define, because it is limited to your ideas and sensations. Your reason tells you that God must be perfect in those attributes to the nth degree. For if God lacked any of them, or was not perfect in any of them to the nth degree, God would not be superior to everything else, and thus would not be God. In order to be superior to everything else, God must not be subject to any change and must not be imperfect in any way imaginable. So here we have another indicator of our own limitations as to God's attributes and qualities. We have an understanding of a small part of the picture. We don't have the capabilities of understanding and seeing the big picture. Just like science, we understand that there are trillions of galaxies out there, each having billions of stars and solar systems, but this is only 10% of the universe out there, 90% of which we don't understand. And these are just estimates in terms of percentages, right? We don't know 90% of the universe that we live in, but we still feel confident. We still feel like we're the kings of the castle here. So we need to truly bring down our ball and understand that what we see and what we understand is still very much changing as we gain more information and as we evolve even more. So even the trillions of galaxies with billions of stars are not enough for us to understand this universe, the material side of the universe that we live in. How can we begin to understand the immaterial God that created all of us, that surpasses everything that is within our understanding? There's a lot to understand here. There's a lot to break down. Allan Kardec is going to give us a logical approach as to all of these elements and why this is our ceiling of understanding, but yet that it is true nevertheless. But we can't confuse the fact that even though they are true, doesn't mean that it is the complete picture. Bear that in mind. God is eternal. If God had had a beginning, then either God would have had to have sprung from nothing, or would have had to have been created by a being that existed previously. Reasoning in this way, we arrive little by little at the idea of eternity and the infinite. God is immutable. If God were subject to change, then the laws that govern the universe would have no stability. God is immaterial. This means that God's nature differs from everything we call matter. Otherwise, God would not be immutable, but would be subject to the transformations of matter. God is one. If there were several gods, then there would be no unity of design or power in the organization of the universe. God is all-powerful because God is one. If God were not powerful above all else, it would mean that there was something more powerful, or at least as powerful. It would mean that God might not have created all things, and those that God did not create would have had to have been the work of some other God. God is supremely just and good. The providential wisdom in the divine laws is revealed in the smallest things as well as in the largest. And this wisdom makes it impossible for us to doubt either God's justice or goodness. So God created us, pure and simple. And we, at this evolutionary stage, can understand these qualities of God. How can we be certain that these qualities are absolutely true? We can't be certain necessarily, but we can certainly hear our own internal voice of logic and reasoning so that we can understand this, just as we solve dilemmas or just like a detective is solving a mystery case. We can go through some tips, some clues, some hints to guide us forward into logical conclusions based on what we can see and what we can determine. God and God's laws are absolutely perfect, and it's undoubtable, this fact. But our understanding of God and our understanding of God's universe is just like people climbing up a hill or hiking up a mountain. You know, we can see the horizon a little bit better than we would be if we were down at the valley. However, there's still a long way up before we reach the summit. So let's walk together. Let's continue working together with harmony, you know, with peace, with love for each other, following Jesus's example of loving our neighbor, loving ourselves, and loving God above everything else, so that we can continue climbing up this hill together to make this world a better place. If you have any comments or any questions about this, make sure that you leave it in the comment section below. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, and tune in for more videos on the meaning of life, on Spiritism and spirituality. See you next time.